Released only a few months ago, the DeepCool AK620 has already made some headlines, thanks to its good design, good cooling performance and ease of installation. However, those are things that others have said, and today it's my turn to see if the AK620 can live up to the expectations. The DeepCool AK620 is a standard dual-tower CPU cooler with two 120mm fans and the possibility of adding a third one for extra cooling. The AK620 has a height of 160mm and a length of 138mm with a width of 129mm. When we talk about the pricing, things are getting interesting, as the DeepCool AK620 can be had for around $60 US. I say around as this CPU cooler has had a lot of prices in the last few months and the real one is up to debate at this point. Thus I am using the last known price when the cooler was in stock. The design of this CPU cooler is good. And I rarely say this for a CPU cooler as there's little to change design-wise for such an established product. All CPU coolers are the same, a heatsink and a fan or more attached to it. However, some manage to stand out and look better while also keeping a low profile. This CPU cooler has no RGB or any LEDs for that matter, and I like that very much, as I consider RGB systems to be a sure way to add more issues to a cooler and more cables and of course a higher price tag overall. The AK620 has an aluminum-made heatsink which uses a dual-tower design. Each of the heatsink towers has 49 aluminum-made cooling fins. It's also worth pointing out that this heatsink is perfectly symmetrical and thus you can install it in any orientation you want. On the lower part of the outer side of each heatsink tower, the cooling fins are shorter than the rest. This is done to increase the clearance around the CPU socket of the motherboard. While this will not help with the RAM clearance, it will help greatly with small motherboards that use taller than average VRM heatsinks. The edges of the cooling fins on the sides of the heatsink are bent down. This is done to increase the rigidity of the heatsink and to channel the air from the fans throughout the heatsink and out the back of the cooler. It's a simple system that works and has been used for many years. It also helps blend everything together in terms of the design of the CPU cooler. The top of the heatsink is covered by plastic-made plates that will help the cooler stand out from the crowd. These plates have a good design with the DeepCool logo placed in the corner. In addition, these plates will hide the endings of the heat pipes, which is great as oftentimes the heat pipe endings are not evenly machined and break the overall aesthetic of the CPU cooler. The AK620 uses 6 copper-made heat pipes, each with an outer diameter of 6mm. Like many other air CPU coolers, these heat pipes are making the contact with the baseplate at the back, and more than likely these are soldered together. Soldering being the best way to ensure optimal thermal transfer between two components. Speaking of the baseplate, this too is made from nickel-plated copper, just like the heat pipes. It has a smooth surface with subtle sunburst patterns etched into each surface. With this CPU cooler, DeepCool has included two 120mm fans. These are the new DeepCool AK620. These have a minimum speed of 500 RPM and a maximum speed of 1850 RPM. Fortunately, thanks to the usage of PWM, this can be controlled through your motherboard or a fan hub. Other features found on these fans include thick rubber pads on the corners of the fan frame to dampen the vibrations of the fans and to protect the heatsink of the CPU cooler from scratches. In addition, these new fans use a fluid dynamic bearing system. Before we head into the installation of the CPU cooler, we must know what is included with it. And first, we have a tube of thermal compound, a backplate, a Phillips screwdriver, a Y splitter cable for the fans, 4 mounting thumb screws, 4 double-threaded nuts, 2 sets of mounting bars, 1 set per platform, AMD and Intel, and finally other type of screws for the remaining sockets. Unfortunately, the user manual is not included. It is instead available online. That is, if you have a way to see it on your smartphone. If that option is not available to you, then you are pretty much out of luck. Even though the user manual is missing in a physical form, you can still install the CPU cooler as it has a good mounting system. You first get the backplate and install it on the back of the motherboard. Afterwards, you screw into the backplate studs these double-threaded nuts. After that is done, you install the correct mounting bars in the desired orientation for your system. You secure the mounting bars with the thumb screws. Finally, you apply the thermal compound on the CPU surface and place the heatsink of the cooler over the CPU. Lining up the springs-loaded screws of the CPU CPU cooler with the threads of the mounting arms. You then tighten those up and you are done. You only have to install the fans on the heatsink and connect them to their correct spots. The installation of the CPU cooler is easy as the mounting system uses few parts and thankfully all of them are made from metal. However, that does not excuse the lack of a physical user manual, even though a lot of manufacturers are starting to do this as well. When we talk clearance, the DeepCool AK620 does alright for a cooler of its size. For graphic card clearance, there is approximately 27mm of space between the graphics cards and the size of the cooler. In terms of the RAM clearance though, things are not as good, as the front fan will interfere with all 4 RAM slots of the motherboard. However, most RAM modules will fit below the fan of the cooler, unless we are talking about TAL or RAM kits. Before we test the performance of the CPU cooler, you will get to hear a noise sample of the cooler running at idle and then at its maximum speed. This is done because while a decibel value reading is useful for comparison, it does not take into consideration unwanted noises such as the fans vibrating on the heatsink, the fan bearing noises, and more. With two 120mm fans that spin at a maximum speed of 1850 rpm, the DeepCool AK620 reached a maximum noise output of 45 decibels, with the recording device placed at a standard distance of 10 cm away from the CPU cooler and the system. This value places the cooler on the lower part of the chart, as while it uses just two fans that only spin at 1850 rpm, the noise generated is higher than coolers that use higher RPM fans. The testing of all CPU coolers, unless otherwise stated, is done with an Intel i9 9900K CPU, which is running at both its factory turbo boost frequency and then it is manually overclocked to 5 GHz on all cores. And we start with the first test, which uses the Intel Burn Test V2 benchmark, a synthetic benchmark that will place a load onto the CPU, which is similar with what you will get while playing a modern AAA video game. And in this test, the DeepCool AK620 reached a maximum temperature of 60 degrees Celsius, with the CPU running at 5 GHz on all cores and a fixed ambient temperature of 26 degrees Celsius. This temperature places the DeepCool AK620 among coolers such as the Noctua NH-U12A, Noctua NH-D15S or the Be Quiet Darkrock Pro 4. However, the next test is where each CPU cooler is tested to its very limits, some even beyond, as this test uses the system stability test of the AIDA 64 Extreme. This benchmark will place an unrealistically high load on the CPU, something which you will rarely if ever encounter in your daily usage. The only scenario where you will get such a high CPU load is if you are doing high resolution video rendering and processing using the CPU as the only rendering unit. And in this test, the DeepCool AK620 reached a maximum temperature of 87 degrees Celsius, with the same 26 degrees Celsius ambient temperature. This result places the DeepCool AK620 right next to the Noctua NH-U12A and the Be Quiet Darkrock Pro 4, a great result for such a new entry into the cooling market. The DeepCool AK620 is a good CPU cooler. It also looks great and it is very well made. The installation is easy as the mounting system not only uses fewer parts than the average CPU cooler, but all of them are made from metal. However, an easy to use mounting system does not excuse the lack of a physical user manual, and while many will disagree with me, I consider that a user manual is important as you will not always have access to the internet or in all places. When we talk about the cooling performance, the DeepCool AK620 performs great. Of course, this is thanks to the dual tower heatsink design and the two included fans. However, other CPU coolers have those as well and yet perform worse. The DeepCool AK620 is good and it will fit in most cases today, even though I will highly advise you to double check everything before you place an order. The major drawbacks of this CPU cooler are the clearance and the sound. Not only is the front fan covering 4 RAM slots of the motherboard, but in my case at least, the fan will rest on the RAM kit. With some TAL RAM modules, this CPU cooler will not work at all. The same can be said for the graphics card clearance, which is not the worst I've seen. However, it could have been a lot better, especially for a cooler that is not exactly cheap. However, the biggest drawback of the DeepCool AK620 is the noise output, which is higher than what I would have liked to see. As a comparison, the Noctua NH-U12A is quieter, has better fans overall, and has amazing clearance for both the RAM kits and the graphics card. The DeepCool AK620 is good, and it is a great alternative to Be Quiet and Noctua, especially if you want to have something different that is easy to install and use. It's also a good looking CPU cooler, and it has no RGBs inside. If you like this review, then you might consider subscribing for more, and if you want to support me in a direct way, then in the description below you will find the links for both the Patreon and the Substar pages of this channel.